Hello and welcome to the bare minimum Chronomancy. This will be a video series for Guild Wars 2 raiding, specifically for Support Chronomancers. In this series I will go over a few tips and tricks to help make raids easier for yourself and for your team, as the Chronomancer role is quite unique to other roles in raids, and getting better performance isn't as straightforward as executing your rotation. Now, this series will assume that you have some experience in raids, have geared up a Chronomancer, understand the basic rotation, but potentially struggle with maintaining uptimes in real fights, or you might get annoyed that your groups are eating easily telegraphed mechanics, or maybe you're just new to playing Chrono. Hopefully this series will help bridge the gap between merely being able to swap to Chrono for your group when no one else wants to do it, and being a legitimate Chrono Jail main. What I will showcase won't be high IQ plays that only top level Chronomancers can accomplish consistently, nor is this series going to be about pushing personal DPS. You're a support class. While DPS is nice, it's less important than providing boons and assisting with mechanics. Now, I'm a fairly mediocre player myself, and a professional rotation butcher, so yeah, don't expect too much. I even have a non-concentration sigil tank set to help myself do certain things without having to worry about rotations. So I feel like everything that I showcase can be done, or at least attempted, by everyone with even but a cursory knowledge of how Chronomancer works in raids, hence the series title. Most of these tricks should be the bare minimum of what can be accomplished by Chronomancers in pugs or casual raid groups, and will help make your run smoother. So before we start looking at encounter specific tricks, let's start with some general ones. The first trick I'm going to talk about is well ticking. One thing that a lot of people miss is that Chronomancer wells don't instantly give boons. They pulse once every second, and on the fourth pulse they pop, and that's when boons are applied. Whether your boons will be boosted by the Sigil of Concentration buff is contingent on whether the well pops while you have the buff, not when you use the skill. So you can have a lot of situations where you can cast a well before swapping weapons and still get the boosted duration on the skill. The next thing I want to go over is the one clone Continuum Split. So essentially this comes down to being able to open your Continuum Split and pop your wells and Signet of Inspiration quickly enough under one clone Continuum Split instead of the typical 3. This is usually done at the start of a fight or phase, and can be useful if you want a quick opening burst of boons, instead of needing to generate 3 clones very slowly. Obviously, whether this is something you want to integrate in all fights is up to you. There are some fights, like Matthias, which might punish you for not casting Signet of Humility, which is Moa, inside Continuum Split near the start of the encounter. But still, it's a handy trick to know and execute consistently, so let's go over how to do it. Start in Sword and Shield. First, summon your clone as the fodder for Continuum Split. Then, you weapon swap to trigger the Concentration Sigil buff. Start summoning your Phantasm. Then, Continuum Split mid-cast. The best time mid-cast to open Continuum Split can somewhat be ping dependent, so your mileage may vary. Practice until you have a good feel for how it works. Because of your trait Synergy, entering Continuum Split will give you quickness and alacrity, and more boons if you have Chaos, which are instantly shared by completing your Phantasm cast due to another trait, which is Lesser SOI, or Lesser Signet of Inspiration. You have enough time to cast Signet of Inspiration on your utility bar and both of your wells in this Continuum Split window. Once Continuum Split ends, you can recast your Phantasm, triggering Lesser Signet of Inspiration again, cast Signet of Inspiration on the utility bar again, then cast both wells again, and weapon swap before those wells pop to take full advantage of the Concentration Sigil buff. The initial burst of boons is large enough that nailing the opener will give you a lot of leeway in your rotation for about 30 seconds, meaning you can think your way through the mechanics instead of worrying about boon application for a significant amount of time. This one clone Continuum Split rotation leads me to my last general topic of discussion, and that is monitoring Lesser Signet of Inspiration. A lot of chronos tend to struggle tracking Lesser SOI cooldown, especially in the heat of the fight, and admittedly sometimes I do too. but by far the easiest and simplest way of tracking lesser Signet of Inspiration cooldown is by using the actual Signet of Inspiration cooldown. In the one clone Continuum Split mini rotation, you'll notice that I always chain SOI and Phantasm Cast one after the other. This enables you to track lesser SOI cooldown very simply. When Signet of Inspiration is off cooldown, so is lesser Signet of Inspiration, and you can utilize your Phantasm casting for the purposes of boon sharing much more consistently. Now that we've talked about a few basic or general things, let's move on to specific encounters. We start with the Veil Guardian, which is the first boss of the Spirit Veil Wing. Again, this series will assume that you know the basics of the fight. There are various raid training discords that can easily help you get up to speed if you want to learn the raid encounters, both in NA and in EU. I'll link some in the description. Now, let's get into some of the mechanics. One of the most important and consistent mechanics you will need to deal with are the blue teleport circles. Due to the latest changes, it is possible to use Sword 2, which is Blurred Frenzy, every blue circle if you have permanent alacrity, and honestly, this should be your go-to method for avoiding blue circles. However, this may not be the case sometimes for whatever reason, so let's go over one other tool that the Chronomancer has to avoid getting teleported. Keeping in mind this may compromise on boon duration for a short amount of time, you can utilize the Deja Vu effect on Shield 4, which is Echo of Memory. After Echo of Memory blocks one set of teleport circles, Deja Vu will stay active long enough to block the next set, releasing a lot of the initial pressure on you to mitigate blue circles for each phase. The next thing I want to talk about is distorting or mitigating the green circle mechanic. This trick has more relevance in groups where you'll be consistently doing something called no greens, though it's still a handy failsafe if your group accidentally fails the mechanic. Now, no greens is a strategy where your group will completely ignore the green circles mechanic, opting to out-heal the damage instead. As a Chronomancer, you have a few tools to make this strategy less painful for others, and especially yourself. The idea here is to utilize your tools to trigger distortion when the green mechanic fails, so that you do not take any damage to yourself. This makes it easier for the druid or druids to heal the group, and obviously means that you will not down to greens if done properly. The other mitigation technique is to use Well of Eternity to trigger a powerful self-heal so that you won't down to the greens, and a strong group heal that will top people up prior to or just after the mechanic fails. If you are already adept at using Blurred Frenzy and Echo of Memory to avoid the blue circles, then you can chain together Well of Eternity, your Distortion Shatter, and Signet of Inspiration if you're playing Domination to avoid the worst of the distributed magic nuke. The final thing I'd like to go over for Veil Guardian is well placement. We went over earlier how wells work, but there may be players out there who simply follow the rotation given, and don't give much thought to how their skills actually give boons. Now, since boon application doesn't happen until the well actually pops, you have to drop the wells in a place where you know the group will be stacked in about 3 seconds into the future. If you drop wells just before moving, or you drop wells while you're moving, then you're just wasting them and not making your boons count. While moving, try to rely on Phantasm casts and Signet of Inspiration to maintain uptimes, but only drop wells down if the group is going to be there when it pops. At the same time, you can't wait until the entire group is on you before you drop your wells. You have to show a bit of positioning foresight and exercise judgment to put wells in the right spot. Now that we're done talking about the Veil Guardian, let's move on to Big Bad Gorseval, a collection of malevolent spirits joined together in rage and anguish. This is quite the DPS fight, so as a Chronomancer, you'll be expected to carry out most of the mechanics for the team so that they can hit Gorseval harder for longer. So now let's go over a couple of things beyond the basics. The first thing I want to talk about is Aegis or stability for Gorseval slams. This is probably one of the more important things that Chronomancers should be able to do more, but can't or don't. Protecting your teammates from being interrupted in the middle of their burst is fairly important in helping to maintain their DPS at high levels. You have different tools to mitigate this attack, depending on your trait setup. If you're running Inspiration Domination, then casting a Signet or Distortion Shatter will reward your friends with Aegis and block the attack entirely. If you have Inspiration Chaos, on the other hand, You can also distortion shatter to give your friends Aegis, but sharing stability to prevent knockdown is also vitally important. Now once you've figured out the build that you want to use for this fight, then choosing your tools is easy. Signet of Ether for domination, and sharing stability normally with Signet of Inspiration for chaos. Learning the timing is as simple as learning Gorseval's attack patterns. Every phase he will have the same attack pattern. He starts with a swipe, then moves onto a slam, which should be mitigated. He does 2 more swipes and then moves onto the next part of the phase or takes a break in between attack chains. The other main thing of note for Gorseval is to take note of well placement. I've talked about how well placement needs to be proactive rather than reactive at VG, showing foresight where wells are placed. This is no different. Players will need to move from spirit to spirit during the split phase every 33%, so laying wells down on spirits who are about to die is just pointless. Put wells down if spirits are above 50%, well above 50% only, otherwise delay and rely on Signet of Inspiration to share boons instead. Well placement also refers to how wells are dropped during the main phases. Remember that Gorseval has a big boy hitbox, so players will often stand far away from the tank. If you are tanking Gorseval, please do not center your wells around your own character. You may miss your subgroup and their uptimes will suffer as a result. Always be mindful of where your wells are placed and how they work. And now we find ourselves staring down the barrel of Sabbatha and her assortment of lieutenants. The Saboteur is one of the more difficult fights in the game, not because of overly punishing mechanics or DPS checks, but because cascading failures lead to very chaotic runs very quickly. Oddly enough, for an end of wing fight, there isn't much for a Chronomancer to do except practice their rotation or maybe push DPS. For once, other roles are loaded with the responsibilities and not the Chrono. Unlike previous fights, there isn't a whole lot for a Chronomancer to do that can make the fight significantly easier or smoother for their groups, but there are still a couple of small things to take note of. The first thing I want to address is ad pulling. Now, most Chronomancers are accustomed to using their focus pull, Temporal Curtain, to bring ads directly onto the boss to cleave, but because the platform at Sabbatha is large and the ads constantly shuffle around, sometimes it's necessary to pull ads to the side of the stack as opposed to directly on it. Cleave will happen, but not if they're too far away from the stack to get hit, so sometimes it's more important to bring them into the proximity rather than aiming to get them right in the middle. Also, take note of when bandit sappers spawn and do not pull them until after they have thrown their bombs and have given the squad members the sapper mechanic. The last thing I'd like to talk about with regards to this boss is distorting the flame wall, actually. A small trick that isn't that known is you can actually distort yourself through the flame wall. It has to be a distort through the distort shatter F4 or signet if you're using a domination trait line, but not that many people know that you can do it, so it can come in handy if you get kicked by a bandit. And that's about all I have for Wing 1. There are other things that you could probably do to make these encounters easier for you and your team, but that's all I can think about at the moment, at least from the perspective of bare minimum chronomancy, things that you should expect from your average pug, but for whatever reason don't get. If you have any suggestions or any feedback, please let me know in the comments below. I'll be releasing more videos in the days and weeks to come, covering the other raid wings, so please like and subscribe if that interests you. I also stream every once in a while on Twitch. My username is quite Crusty. If watching live gameplay sounds like more your speed, then, give me a follow there. And if you've made it to the end of the video, then I admire your patience for putting up with me. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you around for the next video. Have a good one.